One keep. There's that creepy voice lady. If everyone can keep themselves muted throughout, we will prompt everyone when it is Q&A. And if you have questions throughout today's discussion, please put them in the chat and we will recognize those along the way. But otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gordon. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I deeply appreciate being in the space. First of all, what's up? How we doing? How are things going? First of all, I want to give space to the fact that some of my homies are in the call. Amber Spears, I see you. What's up? How you doing? Michigan, go blue all day. Melissa Fernandez, what's up? Thanks for connecting with me a couple of days ago. Your advice was very wise and sage, and I want every single person to know that my father is on the call. So I'm going to annoy him as much as possible while we do things. I didn't expect him to be here, but we're going to take advantage of it, aren't we? So what I'm going to do first is get my presentation in the right places. I'm going to share my screen. Share. Can you all see my screen? Does it look good? I hope so. And I'm going to present. You see big old letters on the screen right now? Thank you so much. We might as well get started. So it's a pleasure to have to be here virtually, digitally, as well as we can be in this very complicated context and this very interesting time. I deeply appreciate everybody that's been on this call, and I hope that whether or not you are from the design, innovation, social change, or not any of those other disciplines, I hope that some of the conversations that we're going to bring to the fore offer up opportunities to think differently about your work, to offer up ideas about where many of the systems of oppression came from, and hopefully some alternatives moving forward, and engaging in your future's stewardship. So let's get started. First, what I want everyone to do is take a second, take a breath. You've probably heard it on Twitter. You've probably heard somebody on Instagram, what have you, that said, breathe. I think one of the most valuable pieces of advice about this entire experience that we've been a part of is recognizing that, as Arundhati Roy specified in her article at the beginning of this entire process, that the pandemic is a portal. It is an opportunity to reform, to transform, to connect and interact with a different type of future that we didn't think was possible. And in doing so, we have to recollect the resources that we have access to, but in many times take advantage. I want to acknowledge the land that I'm currently on, the Osage Nation, the Okapa Nation, and the Sioux Nation, in otherwise known as North Little Rock, Arkansas. I hope that you will recognize the land, the air, the food, the water that you come from, and move forward with that recognition in all the tasks that you engage in. With that, let's get started. We're gonna get started first with a participatory activity. We all design something. We might design briefs. We might design graphic novels. We might work on websites, what have you. For me, one of the things I do all the time is I design spaces, especially artificial spaces, facilitation work to bring people together to say, what are the next steps that we want to do to design something new for our organization or what have you. How do you think about the consequences of your designs? Do me a favor, that link at the bottom is live. Go to bit.ly, bit.ly/equity design matters 1, all lowercase, and you should go to a link. And in a little bit of time, I should start to see that link start to be populated.
I just
Let's
put it
see
in the
you.
chat also. Dr. Pierce.
Yes. So I should start to see different people coming in over time. Cool. I see a whole bunch of anonymous badgers and chameleons and chipmunks. This is how this page works, just so we're clear. Put your name in column B on one of the cells. For instance, you see my name, Pierce Gordon, in B3. Put your name on one of those rows. That is now your row. Okay. So like Amber Spears just did in row 9, choose one and put your name in. If you'd like to put your contact info and methods that we can connect and collaborate either with me or with another person. And you can also put your descriptor of yourself in part C, in row C. Do me a favor, take a second and think a bit deeply. You can say about answering that question that I posed. How do you think about the consequences of your designs? That might mean, what values do you put in when you think about what happens when you put something out in the world? That might mean, what processes do you use to determine if what you do is good or bad, moral, amoral, beneficial, harmful, right? So just take a second and put that in. And then after that, we're gonna, for about 5-ish minutes, I'm gonna ask a few questions for some of the things people have come up with. That make sense? All right, here we go. Additionally, if something comes up that makes you think there is a online resource available that people can use to learn more, then you can put that in the subsequent columns as well. Like in all these different columns that I have established, columns F, G, and H. Okay, you are halfway through time if you are contributing. Additionally, I forgot to say this at the end. I saw a few people logging in on their phone. Obviously, it is a bit more difficult to fill out a Google Sheet if you are on your phone. If you would like to go to your computer, we are welcoming you, but if not, you can watch the other things that people are saying and contribute in that fashion. Okay, we about just have one more minute. Wonderful. I appreciate all of you for putting on your thinking caps at the beginning of a conversation. Normally, I assume for many of the talks that I've been a part of, I have not been required to contribute. Usually this is is the banking form of education where I come to to learn about someone else's perspective, but I wanted to get you all primed in thinking about what the consequences of the things that we create, especially as a conversation today that lays a foundation for and builds up the ideas of equity in our work. And I see some fantastic ideas I haven't thought about myself. Definitely environmentalism is a critical topic. What social issues are there? Is your information accurate? Learning about different people's stories and experiences, the potential offensive imagery. I appreciate that, Spencer. That's an important concept in a lot of people's work. Recognizing what offends them, whether or not they are in or out of that group, of if it connects to them or not. The reason why I wanted to connect to that idea is because this is a question that I came across in doing one of my projects that then framed so many of the experiences that I've been a part of since then, that all lie in the fields of design, international development, and innovation. What you're seeing here right now is actually one of those linchpin projects that I describe all the time. In 2016, I was blessed to be a part of an opportunity called the International Development Design Summit. While in grad school, I had the chance to conduct research with a community where we spent 4 weeks from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. every single day doing a design process with the indigenous communities in the Kalahari Desert, that's in Botswana, from our team creating a deep sand wheelchair. What you're actually looking at right now is the final prototype of our project. You'll see certain design changes on our wheelchair versus the current wheelchair rider. His name is Jepta, that he had to deal with, that make it easier to ride over sand. And fortunately, it was a blessed opportunity that then evolved into a 2-year dissertation research respite over across the entire country that asks, how do innovators evaluate? And frames that in context with the entire economic system working to be transformed, as it is all across the continent. It's a part of a program called the International Development Innovation Network that has done a lot of work since obviously before COVID hit to support the development of co-design initiatives. They run design summits like the one I was a part of. They have volunteer summit organizers. They have network members. They are living all across the world. They've had active solutions in the pipeline and have hit over 500,000 people around the world. And these numbers actually aren't even the most recent statistics. Also laid by the foundations of both international development and design work, trying to put further the fields of appropriate technology 2.0, designing alongside community members to address the tangible issues that are affecting them in poverty that they can themselves address. And it was sensational to be a part of that experience. And it was also extremely useful from my background to leave the space, especially after 2 years, to go back to the community to learn whether or not there was the consequences, the impact that we thought it would. I also had the chance to learn about in this specific village, all of the different communities that had done work before we got there. So from secondary research in a litany of different interviews and perspectives, I learned about the inception of the Kudu Development Trust, Kudu meaning do it yourself with this indigenous community, the Nato Language Project that was still running for 25 years to translate the Click consonant language into Bibles, the Working Group of Indigenous Minorities in Southern Africa Project, working towards social justice and engagement with this specific community. Interestingly, that last project you see, Kellogg and Ba Isaho Lifelong Entrepreneurship Training Program, the project basically had, I would argue, 60% of the same type of topics and methodological focuses as our project, but we never knew it existed. By doing this work, I had the opportunity to learn about all these communities that came in with design chops and their own expertise in their fields and said, we're going to make a change and benefit and help these communities. And in so many ways, did not affect the systemic issues that these communities were being plagued with since before we got there in the first place. The politics were complex. The issues were immensely difficult to deal with. And there were little opportunities for designers like us to learn about the ways that our issues were not affecting the real problems. It actually turned into a critical part of my dissertation work, that history, that understanding of who, not only how the consequences shake out, but who benefits from what. Arguably, because I'm speaking to you right now from the work that I did before, in some ways, I benefited more than the communities that we're doing the work alongside. And in many ways, people that do this type of development and design work follow this same system, from creating our portfolios and creating our resumes of the work that we did abroad or in social impact work. And we have we are unable to have the full opportunity to broaden our gaze towards many of the issues and struggles that they are addressing because of the systemic issues that they're facing. Why did I tell you that story at the beginning? Because there's a lot of fantastic storytellers that are in this design and innovation world that do a lot of work to express, why should you be listening to me in the first place? I've done this fantastic project in X place for Y amount of time. I've had expertise putting this impact out in the world, and it's a very rosy, fantastic story that fails to tell, in many situations, the entire experience. Even the stories in these situations are inequitable. And so many of my experiences, I've taken that critical mindset to many of the projects I've been a part of. I decided, both because my fiance is there, full disclosure, but after the research after I finished my PhD, to live in Botswana to help support the work that was being engaged by doing facilitation work, by helping with the Botswana Policy Hackathon, the first one that happened in the country, to connect and learn about how social impact design could help this community. At the same time, I was blessed to, where I am right now, serve for a year as the inaugural Innovation Fellow at the Arkansas Regional Innovation Hub. One of the interesting projects of which you see the fantastic pictures of, we actually, as a makerspace, set up a pop-up makerspace in a place called Northwest Arkansas, very famous for the headquarters of Walmart and J.B. Hunt and many other very powerful entities. And we created this pop-up makerspace for the Latinx, Black, and Marshallese communities to help facilitate opportunities to understand the value of making, art, and entrepreneurship. Additionally, I was blessed during my graduate school program to connect with other people, of which you'll hear in a little bit further down the conversation. The worlds of combining the design thinking, innovation practice, participatory design to social justice, equity, activism work, and combined to create Reflex Design Collective, of which they're still working in the Bay Area, and I'm blessed to have them as colleagues. but we did fantastic work like deal with Oakland homelessness with the Oakland City Council and a litany of other projects. And I hold those spaces as an opportunity to comment a little bit about where our field comes from, where our world comes from, why that fits into the ideas of equity, and where our world is going. And part of the reason why I became so entrenched in this topic is because of all of these debates that exist around human-centered design, around environment-centered design, around when we're trying to create what the world should look like. Who do we isolate on and why? And why does that become the frame for what the future looks like? Especially because who we isolate on in many situations are deeply, deeply affected by issues of equity, justice, and liberation. So today we're going to be talking about the limits of centered design and all the ways that we can break those limits in our own work for everything that we're doing. Designers love maps. They love visualizations. I realize that's one of the fantastic qualities of all of the presentations I came to yesterday. Admittedly, I saw so many people's graphic design chops and I'm like, yikes, are mine going to be good enough? But that's especially why I wanted to show a map like this. What this is, to be clear, is in a class called Modernity and Coloniality, of which everyone on this call can take. You go to modernitycoloniality.com, taught by a professor, I believe in New York, called Ahmed Ansari, that teaches how design is influenced by the construction of our global world system. And by talking about that, the first thing they talk about is what the world system looked like before colonialism, before mercantilism. And this is a chart of what that looked like. Essentially, what you should recognize in this idea is the fact that instead of one massive interconnected global system that came from, that has seemingly inexplicable centers that represent where knowledge, information, labor, design, and art come from. Instead, there were individual circuits that people connected and interacted with. You see certain circuits of the Middle Eastern and the North African communities, of South Africa, Southern India, and a litany of these communities that shared, connected, interacted in a litany of different ways. And what's valuable about these things is that they all had their own institutions, their own political, economic, social, cultural institutions. And innovation in many ways did not happen at the center of these places where you could see a lot of the activity. It actually happened on the margins, where there were interconnections between the circuits. The margins or borders were the sites of the most exchange. And the reality of how they connected and interacted with each other reflected that consistent activity. Obviously, this changed through a litany of different projects and resources developed initially by the Spanish and the Portuguese, essentially coming to Latin America for the first time and creating and building upon a system that essentially developed a litany of power structures that sustain to this day. At its core, what is best to understand is how there were many different world systems that existed and connected and rose and fall together. And now there is one world system that in many ways might rise and fall together. Racism came from this system. The exploitation of the environment came from this system. And every single other form of oppression, of which we're going to see a litany of examples, came from the recognition that there is the creation of a center fueled in many ways by the periphery. This is relevant in design. This happens at its core. The main professor that speaks about this idea is a designer and a critic of the field. This is actually talked about in one of the main canon topics of this field, Notes on the Synthesis of Form by Christopher Alexander, that talks about the unself-conscious cultures, differentiating in many ways from other different fields between people that engage in the higher act of design and the quote unquote lower act of craft. This Orientalism, this racism is built into how our field has been constructed from the core. And a litany of the other topics and fields that interact with them simultaneously are built around this creation of a center and a periphery. There are many ways that you can define these centers and these peripheries, how class is formed, how labor is divided, who has high value labor and low value labor, political and economic institutional structures that are replicated all across the world, racial and ethnic hierarchy, gender, sex, spiritual, epistemic, and linguistic. And you've probably already seen it by now, but number 10, an aesthetic hierarchy of high art versus low or world art. And one that actually makes sense to me as well, that on number 11, a pedagogical hierarchy, where you learn is considered higher than other types and forms of where other people learn. There are many ways that this manifests, and there are many more than just are on this list, but recognizing this is essential in recognizing where oppression comes from so that we can understand how we can address it as a whole. And the reality is these designs spread the collateral of oppression. They have the consequences that we can see, and that in many ways that have been subsumed into myth and invisibility in what we create and how we create. It affects our past. Let's say we've made something. My portfolio is filled with so many things that I've created, like many other people before. And the things that we create, like that wheelchair, have social lives outside of our intentions, right? There are things that it does and creates in the world that we do not control. What's important about that I realized when writing my blog post, 100 Racist Design, is how so many of those consequences are laced with racism, right? For example, the optical heart rate monitors that see different skin colors, sometimes more, some more than others, right? Or the server tipping system that is run by Uber Eats and all the ways that we get our groceries if you're too scared to go outside, that was created because of the Civil War being ended and Black people not being able to get sufficiently waged jobs and going into service positions, and white people creating laws around how much those people could make. And additionally, speech recognition technology, for instance. This is one of my favorites because I realized in my research, obviously, whether or not a technology can hear you is affected by your accent, whether more American or not. And even the American accent that went through history has a story of race. In fact, the American accent that many people see, especially in the 40s and the 50s, that represent a mid-Eastern accent is fake. It is artificial. It was created. Many people that study the field will talk about how it was constructed specifically to sound okay, but no one actually sounded like that in those environments. And how people speak across societies are affected by how people listened in those times, which means the data was affected by the foundations before the data was even created. It affects our present, right? Because it affects our personal bubbles. When we're engaging in the process of design, when we're making something, it affects not only the activities we engage in, whether we bring people to co-design or we create something on Illustrator or we sign a brief, or it also affects the power that we have as designers to affect our surroundings. There's very little conversation in the design community about how when you say you're trying to change the world, do you actually have the influence to do so in the ways that you want? This is a very burgeoning conversation on how design as a transdisciplinary field can learn from other fields of what it means to be good and influence the people, influence the communities to change the world in the ways that make sense. Because there's a lot of ideation and creation and prototyping, but if it's not sustained and put into practice, how much will it actually affect? That also affects our future. Specifically in the design world, it affects how we envision our future, the limits on those things. What what it means to imagine the world. For instance, I just had a conversation today with some colleagues about the incessant reality of storytelling and Joseph Campbell, right? That he is the main progenitor of what it means to tell a story in many situations. Indigenous communities will tell you otherwise. A story doesn't always have to look like a straight line or a circle. Sometimes it can look like a flower. There are certain communities that leave massive Twitter threads that talk about alternative methods of storytelling that doesn't look and feel like the male orgasm. And in those conversations, offer up not just the structure, but who else can tell the future? What alternatives, ways could we, and values do we bring the world together? A very powerful tool in doing this that I actually suggest everyone in the design world tries to check out is N.K. Jemisin speaking her hour-and-a-half long class on world building, on creating macro and meso level worlds, especially because as a science fiction writer that's very successful, doing this type of work makes you be able to take and create your own world for yourself. I'd argue that's an essential task for anybody that's engaging in design, so you can recognize how things you create might affect things in the future. So there's a lot of info I just threw at you, right? In this context, now we're gonna click on that link again, and we're gonna ask ourselves the questions with that information. The first question is about the past. How do you recognize and navigate histories in your design process? The second question is about the present. The third question is about the future. I want to take some time, take about 5 minutes, and we're going to actually speak on the concepts and the ideas that we come up with here. But take some time, click on that link, go to that link if you have the access to. Kimberly, you're putting it in the...
Yes, the first link is in the chat.
Sure, thank you very much. Please, if you have questions about all the things that we talked about, let's leave those questions to the end of the conversation. But for now, do me a favor and go to town. I'm going to set the timer. If anybody has any issues or concerns with actually reaching the resource, please put it in the chat so that we can access it collectively.
Dr. Gordon, this is Lee. Can I just ask you a quick question?
Sure.
So could you just, so we're answering how do you recognize and navigate histories in your design process? Could you just say it a different way, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
The past affects what we create. How do you think about the past? How do you negotiate? How do you deal with? How do you affect? Do you think about it at all? If you don't, how might you think about it? Another way to say about it is different things have different histories, different communities, different cultures, different environments, different spaces, right? Different institutions. How do those histories affect what you create? While that's happening, I might as well speak on the second questions. How does your positionality limit your perspective? Some people might not know what positionality means. That means positionality means everything about your identity and how that affects who you are in the world. Me being a Black man, for instance. Me being an American, for instance. So all of those realities, that limits me being able to see what my designs can create. When I was dealing with the wheelchair, for instance, I couldn't stay with the community. I cannot speak Naro. I cannot connect and interact with the community and how they deal with that wheelchair project. That's a limit. What are some of your limits? For the last one, what communities offer alternative futures that lie outside the normative design imagination, right? So many people on the margins have created things to help them survive and thrive in a system that is not made for them, right? So if you learn from those communities, which communities could you learn from to help construct something that is separate from what we traditionally see in all of our collective worlds? So as people are finishing up their talks, if anybody would like to speak on some of their concepts, I'd love to hear about what you said and what that made you think about. You can unmute yourself if you'd like. Jenny May, I really appreciate that working within the administrative / educational framework, outside of our framework, that we run into those project limitations as well. The fact that everything is feels so short term in all the context. I appreciate you making that known. Andres, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. I appreciate that idea of having to know the history of the stories that you're trying to tell. I think the difficulty in so many different design environments is the fact that I've seen many designers focus on the recent history of their environments, what they've been dealing with now, and not necessarily the space of what happened maybe 20, 30, 50, 500 years ago that might have affected the systems that affected. So many designers don't know about the history of modernity and coloniality, but those things affect us today. So I appreciate the fact that you do that in your work. Arden Stern, I'm glad to hear like the design historian being reflected in this during this call. So much of the experiences of people that try to create the world, personally, I hated history. I will admit, it is not my favorite field to learn from and be a part of. So the fact that I had to come to history from perspectives that made me learn about why history mattered to my existence made me actually have appreciate the value for the craft. So I appreciate the fact that you're doing your work. So I appreciate these thoughts. I appreciate these ideas. Did anybody want to speak on some of their perspectives? If at all possible, I would like students to speak on your perspectives first. I can open up to anybody if anybody wants to speak. That's all right. I appreciate all of you for being here in the first place. I'm going to keep moving with my conversation if that's all right. So let's talk about alternatives. Let's talk about, we've talked enough about the difficulties and where we got, how we got here, and the ways that design create the world that we all inhabit. There are alternatives that specifically deal with recognizing how equity influences our design work. So I'm sure you all have heard by now this word, intersectionality, this idea that many people in our world live at not just one, but multiple intersections of oppression at the same time. The question is, where did it come from, actually? Kimberly Crenshaw, the creator of the topic, who is actively doing consistent and sensational work to further what intersectionality means, created it in 1989, actually during her legal work. The work was made especially for recognizing how, my apologies, it was made specifically for Black women that were suing different community members, specifically, for instance, General Motors, Hughes Helicopter, and Travenol, for issues related to whether employment and unemployment concerns. So when they brought the suit to the fore, the jury, the judge decided to look into the statistics to determine if Black women were discriminated against when compared to other different communities. So what the powers that be decided to do is they look at the statistics with Black men and they look at the statistics with white women to determine if there were changes between them. And therefore, if there were changes between them, obviously, then Black women would be discriminated against. They found none, therefore they ruled that there was no discrimination. Obviously, the topic goes much more into depth about which communities advocated for, what the cases actually meant. But the point behind this topic then built the foundation for recognizing all of the ways intersectionality connects and interacts with our lives, whether that is race, gender, sex, ability or disability, class, nationality, and all the ways that we live at those intersections because we as humans don't live single issue lives. Another topic that came to mind that you should know in engaging in this type of equity design work is the Matrix of Domination, developed by Patricia Hill Collins, that recognizes when facilitating conversations around intersectionality, that the power that you have in a society is affected by what intersections you live at, right? So if you are abled, if you are a Black man, if you are, how you connect with people also affects these things. Similarly, it says these agents of power are affected through how we see ourselves, different stages, how we connect and interact with other people, and how we connect and interact with massive institutions of power. And recognizing that is essential when recognizing what it means to engage in design work. So let's talk about equity design. What is equity design in this work? Let's first describe exactly what it's not. Equity design is not inclusive design, right? Inclusive design and universal design are different topics that I'm sure that many people on the topic on the call have heard and connected with, that works to understand how we can design for all, right? There are many different people in that advocate for disability measures to make sure that everyone can access public space, right? And we're going to learn a little bit about that later in the call. The difficulty around that is the fact that universalization erases difference and produces self-reinforcing spirals of exclusion. But personalized and culturally adaptive systems too often are deployed in ways that reinforce surveillance capitalism. You'll hear exactly the, the topic that came up with that quote. Inclusive design, instead of design for all, is not the same as equity design, where we recognize how different people are affected differently by how they sit in the intersections and the matrix of domination. Co-design is not equity design. So many of the conversations for the midterm that I was a part of talk about how we can co-design alongside many communities, whether they're specialists in environmental work, specialists in the health industry, or in business or what have you, that connecting with those people will help us create something that has everyone's values, everyone's process, everyone's incentives considered when they do their work. But that's not equity design either. It's important to recognize that when you're trying to participate with communities, that doesn't necessarily mean that you recognize where they sit in the matrix of domination, or whether or not you recognize their positionality or even yours when doing this type of work. Empathetic design either is not equity design. So empathy is a big trigger word for so many different designers. You have to design with empathy. It's important to have empathy. I think what really connected with me personally about the problem with the word empathy is reading a book called Never Split the Difference, that is created by an FBI counterintelligence agent, that talks about, here's how you can negotiate your way out of anything, right? Here are all the methods and tools, techniques, and they're valuable, and I'm learning from them every day. But the core of the work when doing any type of negotiation work, whether with a counter-terrorist or whether you're trying to buy a car, is tactical empathy. Using empathy literally as a weapon for understanding and connecting with your the person on the other side of the table. A lot of people in the design world conflate empathetic design with moral design, with design for social impact. And that is not something that we can do when we're trying to address issues that are baked in oppression. This is one of the most critical pieces that I want you to recognize, that the experts of the failings of the world system that we are a part of are those at the margins, not the center. They're the communities that recognize when these systems, these institutions are failing the way that we do in so many different ways. We see that today. We've seen that across the entire COVID experience. The communities that we must learn from are the ones that had been living in these environments, whether they're Black, whether they're disabled, whether they're queer, what have you, that have necessarily for their own existence created ways to survive, so that when those issues affect all of us, we're running for the hills to figure out what needs to be done, which is why we need to recognize when we're doing our design work, equity needs to be designed at the core, right? So in doing so, we can recognize different communities that are doing equity across the entire equity spectrum. So some people, like the community I connected with, defined an entire world in 2017 around equity design, a creative process to dismantle systems and oppression towards liberation and healing by centering the power of the communities historically impacted. So our communities, from the Creative Reaction Lab to the National Equity Project to Beta Design, we're all across the US facilitating work that makes sure that we hold space for the communities that are at the center of being affected by these issues. Another level past that is the idea of justice. This book is immediate canon in the design world. Design mediates so much of our realities and has tremendous impact on our lives. Yet very few of us participate in the design processes, right? The people that are affected by these systems tend to have the least influence on the decisions and how they're made. So much of the design work being the decisions that we make about how the world gets created. Those conversations around the matrix of domination, around intersectionality, connecting that to the design world is one of the critical contributions of this book, and how to do so effectively in our classrooms, in our design spaces, in the narratives that we tell, in who is a part of this process. Another level past that is the conversations around liberation. I recently was blessed to be a part of a community, the Designers Protest community, that dedicates to creating design justice in the built environment. And in doing so, they've done a litany of different projects together that push not just past equity and justice, but think about the future of what the world could look like in liberatory spaces. And one of those ideas is the Anti-Racist Justice Index that creates different ways that people can act, as you can see on the y-axis, from acknowledging to reparations to including influence, to all of the different ways that it looks from equality all the way to liberation. There's information past this though. There's the idea of sovereignty, right? We talked about the early, when you learned about the where this all came from, oppression in its first place, that recognize that this world system that we created has created, in essence, a single universe of experience where we all try to be like the center in ways that we recognize and some that we don't. So the alternative when doing decolonizing work, when trying to get rid of that reality, is to create a pluriverse, a world of many worlds as created by the Zapatistas in the 1970s. So there are people engaging in pluriversal design, not necessarily where integration is created, where we're trying to connect and interact and be equitable with people that are different diversity levels than us, but spaces of power and sovereignty where we can exist and survive without having to suck up to the powers that be. So there are many different examples of these types of equity design that exist all through the world. But I just wanted to give you some examples that you can chew on to say, like, okay, so there's been a lot of topic, a lot of theory, a lot of history. What are some ways that this actually manifests in society? Here's one of my favorite examples. Unfortunately, this app no longer is available to be downloaded, but when it was, I put a good amount of money into it. It was using spare change to pay bail funds. The way I thought about it was, has anyone ever heard of the app Acorn? Acorn is, if you buy something using your Chase card or what have you, there's a little bit of money that came up from the back of that. That money then immediately gets invested into your account, your investment account. This is Acorn to pay bail funds, right? For so many people that are incarcerated because they cannot afford bail. Another one of my favorites, the Make the Breast Pump Not Suck movement. So it's more than just a conference. It's more than just a connection. It's more than just a community. It's a movement of community members that realize the importance and value of holding space, not just for women's empowerment, for the consideration of the women experience, but all the ways that they can connect and build community around products and services that serve women having and rearing children, and other people also, to be clear, who have breasts. This is one of my favorites, actually. Ed Roberts campus. This is one of my favorites because I literally walked by it every single day. This is in, I don't know how many people have been in the Bay Area. Obviously, things don't look like this right now, but this is literally 5 blocks away from where I used to live. Ed Roberts campus, some people on this call actually might recognize them as well, because as I understand, some Art Center College of Design administrators were critical in designing it in this form. This is an international example of creating a campus specifically for and by people that are disabled. There are so many different examples in here in how people connect and move and interact that show the possibility of this type of work. That's actually, let's talk a little bit about the past. I don't know how many people have ever heard of the curb cut effect. Have you heard of it? You should look it up, because it's an idea that was created by the disability justice movement in the 1970s and 80s, that then spread to legal communities and spread to the UX development communities that talked about how when you design an intervention for a marginalized community, most of the time, it tends to affect everybody. Here's the story. At midnight, on campuses, on UC Berkeley's campus and in places in the Berkeley area, different people who were in wheelchairs and the like, when the streets were bare, went in and poured tar so that they could create ramps whenever people could come and connect when 8 o'clock rolled around. That story then turned into a litany of different project resources and pressured movements against the Berkeley community and then the national government to make public advocacy for disabled communities a national issue. And then the laws came in, changes occurred, and you see curb cuts all over the place so that people can connect and interact with them. And what happened? People with skateboards, people with bicycles, like I did all the time in this area, people who had baby carriages used the curb cuts to their benefit because of the advocacy of these communities years ago that said that we deserve to be in these public spaces. That curb cut effect is one single design consideration that came out of the possibilities, obviously, of universal and inclusive design, but definitely influenced by equity design. So I don't want to leave you with nothing, right? So there's been a lot of conversation of where this came from, what it means to engage in equity design work, and different people that have done it before. But in doing social impact work, the question then becomes, how do I do it myself? Like, where do I go? How do I move, right? So in doing that, I wanted to leave you with some methods that I love personally in engaging with this work. One of my favorites is the participatory timeline. The idea is you make a timeline together. You build a collective understanding of the past. Here's how it works. You get all of the people together that are a part of an organization or part of a community to say, we want to know what happened with this issue. We want to know how this city was built. We want to know how this project was instilled. Bring them all together. You have the person who is the most wise and aged, for my advanced age people, to set, this is the first thing that happened that was important to us, right? And then at the other end of the timeline, you set the present. And then everybody that's in the room collectively creates the events together. You set the first event on the timeline, you mark important events, and you build and grow over time. Another method that I like using is called a systemic persona. So how many of you all try to create understandings of your customers, of your beneficiaries, of people that you're trying to affect, right? And in doing so, you do research on them, you learn about them, and you try and say, okay, this is who I'm trying to affect, this is who I'm trying to deal with, right? And you might list a story of them navigating the world and some of their likes and dislikes and how they connect and interact with society, right? Let's add systems on it, right? So you name how your system affects your human. You might do the same thing that you're doing with a normal persona, but you also try to name the systems around them that affect them. For instance, when we were doing work with unhoused populations in the Oakland area, we could ask questions about environmental racism. We could ask about where are they traditionally working with, and where in West Oakland, particularly around the industrial environments, and how does that affect them in their health, right? We could ask connections with the business ecosystem, right? So they're deeply affected. One of the big reasons why people are so frustrated with unhoused communities is because business owners say, I don't want them on my porches. I don't want them on my parks. The connections between those people and other people that are in that business ecosystem brings a lot of value to you recognizing who this person is. And you can also, at the end, talk about, when you have that context with the system, talk about how that person deals with the systems that they can't control and navigates them as a result. What decisions do they make? What design hacks do they create? How do they think more about their world? Here's one of my favorites that more conversation needs to happen about. It's called the power cube. So many different social impact projects I've been a part of, they create a 2x2 graph. On one side, they might have impact. On another side, they might have change possibility. They create these graphs of how much power and influence a stakeholder has when dealing with a particular project, right? So if I'm talking about connecting with Walmart, right, in Northwest Arkansas, they have a lot of power over others, and not many people can influence them to make their changes about their work, right? Those are a lot of resources and tools. But we can do better. The Power Cube, there's actually a website called powercube.net that I'll show you in a little bit. that gives you a different way of thinking about power. Not just who has power and who can be influenced by them, but the different forms of power, visible power, like, for instance, a boss firing somebody else, or hidden power, like different ways that people connect and interact with. If someone else gets fired, how do you make sure that you make sure you're safe in your work? Or invisible power, different things that we don't see but affect us every single day. The spaces that power gets changed in. So whether or not most power moves, most decisions are made in closed spaces, right? Not everybody can be a part of those decisions because they're designed to be closed off from the community. There are invited spaces. They are closed traditionally, but you can come in to help us make these decisions at these times, and reclaimed spaces as well. And power happens at different levels: local, national, and global. So when you're doing your work, you can recognize how you influence others in that work, and potentially how you can change how you traditionally influence people when doing your work. Community historians. So much of this is also about redefining expertise, right? So in this equitable work, so many of the experiences that we traditionally co-design with, they have a certain amount of professional background that represents a reason why we should talk to them in the first place. So if they have a PhD, if they make a certain amount of money, if they own a business, if they hold some type of political power, right? So much of these experiences is flipping that on its head and recognizing and valuing the lived experience and expertise of communities that live at these intersections. And in doing so, you give them the power to tell the stories, to collect the data, and decide what happens with the data, right? They analyze, they communicate, they make decisions about that work, whether it's about the laws that are created, whether it's about how you create a product or a service, or how you decide to influence somebody that you need to influence. So you have them be a part of that process. And if anything, you take power away from yourself so that they can do what they want to do. So this next part, this is the next piece I wanted to include in. You knew it was coming. You knew it was coming. Equity Design Matters 3. It's another bit.ly page. And I want you to think in your work about methods, tools, spaces, and resources that you use as designers, right? That's the first question. Just for that section, I want you to go to this link. Do me a favor and don't go to the second question yet. We're going to spend a little time. I want you to list the tools that you use when you traditionally design, right? If that means I want you use Google Calendar to connect and learn about where you can make meetings. If that means I like bringing people together and listening to them. For me as a researcher, I like holding Zoom space to do research work. I like to write. I like to design. I like to draw. I like to, whatever that resource is, methods, tools, what have you. Take a second and brainstorm all the ones that you traditionally use in your own decision-making work. This is going to take about 2 minutes. And you can come online if there are any comments, questions, or concerns as well. All right. You have some thoughts, you have some tools, you have some ideas. Some of them on a computer, some of them in your head. I get it. Cool. Next, I want you to think of issues, artifacts, and the like that reflect equity and liberation, both in positive and negative ways. You think of values that relate to equity, whether it means engaging in moral work or engaging in co-design or intersectionality. You can think of your own experiences or other people's experiences that reflect issues of equity, of difference. You can reflect institutions, different ones that either support or denigrate issues of equity and liberation. So in the next column, column F, take a second, about 2 more minutes, and try and think about equity as you see it out in the world, either as it affects you or how it affects others. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. We'll take a couple of seconds and we're going to do that. Okay, you have 1 more minute left on this one. About 30 more seconds. Try and get your final ideas out. All right, all right, all right. Step away from the computers, my people. Not that far though. We have a little bit more work to do. So this is what I want you to do. I want you to go to somebody else's column. All right, we're doing a round robin, virtual round robin, right? In that, I want you to look at their information that they listed. If they did not list enough for you to give a lot of ideas, but you can infer, you can adapt, you can evolve, but go to someone else's column. And I want you to look at those and figure out if any opportunities arise at the intersections of the previous 2 columns. Okay, I'll give you an example for mine. Like I said, I love to use Google Docs. It's free and available to others, right? And one problem is when dealing with Botswana and doing that work, there's so many people, I don't understand Setswana, right? So there's a lot of people that I would want to connect with and learn from that I can't read what they're typing, right? So an opportunity at the intersections is to become an advocate for a Google translation for Setswana, right? Does that make sense? So you're going to see in someone else's information 2 things that come together of all of the different things that they described. And you could have more than one, right? But try to brainstorm opportunities about how you can marry tools, methods, activities, things that we use to influence change when we're designing things with values, struggles, experiences, expertises, institutions that deal with issues of equity. Does that make sense? Take a second. If you have any questions, I'm here for you. But for now, I'm going to put about three minutes on the clock. Okay. Appreciate you. Also, try to do your best not to delete someone else's information. Like I honestly just did very quickly. Just try to respect other people's space in this, my friends. All right, y'all, we got about maybe 30 more seconds. All right. No more time. No more time. Back off from the computer. Pretty please. I would love, I would be amazing if I could have anybody speak on some of the ideas that they came up with. What was the resource? What was the intersection of dealing with equity? And what idea came up with combining the two?
If it's okay, I can just talk about the one that I sort of focused on. It was, I chose Christine's, and just in her first like question of the methods and tools and spaces, she put like attending talks and meetings and making sure like keeping up to date within using Google Docs, Google Drives, and calendars of that sort, and then sort of thinking about like their experiences, like access to equipment and the cost of equipment. When they're a student, they're affected their ability to have like more of those resources, and then sort of connecting it of doing more sort of inner like community outreach and accessibility through like maybe more local resources. I remember like earlier in the quarantine when there's a lot of Excel spreadsheets and Google Docs of within that community like resources and materials just to aid one another. I think that was an example that I saw.
Yeah, I love those. Though that I remember when when Trump first got elected, there were countless many different examples that went all across the world, and I spent so much time trying to collect them from my own resources, even if they weren't my local community, right? Just for examples and ideas that could help. There's so many opportunities for content creation. I love that idea. I appreciate you for speaking up. Any other ideas? Thank you, Christine, for posting that in the first place. Here's an idea I came up with. This is based off of John Mayfield's ideas, specifically connecting Zoom in classrooms with Black Lives Matter. The idea was developing Black Lives Matter scheduling. So the movement manifests in a lot of different ways and shapes to try and advocate for the humanity of Black lives. And in so many ways in professional and academic environments, we are not open to the ways that our issues might be affecting other Black folks, unless you're Black. It's a long, many different conversation there. So one thing that might be valuable is opening up space for community members to be held accountable for their actions, to learn from people that are connected and or affected by being Black in their environments, and offer alternative ways that their work can become a space of advocacy, a space of healing, a space of transformation by creating those scheduling ideas. I don't know if it's the best idea, but it was something that came together. I appreciate you, John, for putting those ideas together. Any other thoughts? I appreciate you all. I appreciate you sending this, putting all this information in. This is very useful for my own work. I'm going to move on to some of the stuff I've been creating. I wanted to note in all of this work that we went complex, we went far into the past, we talked about today, we talked about a lot of people doing a lot of different types of work, and we talked about how to do it in our own work. And there are many ways to do this work well. There are many countless opportunities to consider how people at the margins, how issues of liberation, how learning about different cultures and communities, how recognizing your identity and how that both limits and influences what you affect, change how we do design work. One thing I want to cement in this work, especially today, is that no matter what happens because of people in power, people are going to continue to survive. It is survival, it is thriving for people at the margins to create their own futures, right? And in doing that work, it is very valuable and a potential true, real opportunity for learning about ways that we can fully redesign with our resources, with our capacity, with our institutional knowledge to reframe the system that has not existed for the entire existence of the world into more equitable, into less exploitative, into more restorative environments. Equitable design is possible, and it takes on many different words and concepts and ideas, and it is a very deep and broad field of which I'm only a small part. But the reality is we are, if you decide to be a part of this community, we will take you in, we will help, we will hold you accountable, and we will build together, because there's so much more that needs to be built in our difficult worlds. The pandemic is the portal. The question is, who is going to be making the future? So with that, I got some stuff for you. I got some tidbits, I got some goodies. all of those links that I sent before, all the things that I've discussed, those will become accessible to you. You probably, if you are like I think a lot of you are, if you've gone a bit too far, you probably hit on that last tab and seen some of the resources that were available. All of those resources are the things that I've discussed in this talk today. Additionally, many other resources that I made available. The equity design list, a Google sheet that I made myself, the fantastic books of Race After Technology, Design Justice, What Can a Body Do? The Creative Reaction Labs, Equity Center Design Toolkit, Queer Design Club, Decolonizing Design, Design Gigs for Good, looking for people that are looking for jobs that are social impact focused. And that class I told you about, Modernity and Coloniality, of which I'm still learning an immeasurable amount about. So if you want to go to that, click on this link, do that link, Equity Design Matters 4, to access those resources. Also, because this is an editable document, if you know about resources that should be in the intersections of equity and design, put it down, make it available to everybody, and I know I will definitely make it available to the outside world. With that, I'm going to close this conversation and open it up for any pieces of content that anybody wants to talk about today. If anybody has any questions, comments, and concerns, I'm available. If anybody wants to talk afterwards, my email and my Twitter are available there. So, it's been a pleasure to be here.
Dr. Gordon, I have something I'll share. So I feel like, you know, we have a lot of tools, right? And you talked about co-creation, co-designing, participatory design. You know, you were at our Design Matters TDS on Monday, our midterm. And oh, and there's Penny. She's in the car. Thanks for joining, my co-teacher. Anyway, I guess my question is, I feel like where at least I personally and what I've seen in studios, and I'm just going to speak about the academic in this circle, is not so many tools for process in terms of really inviting into, right? So we've got these immersive empathy and these ways of like gaining deeper understanding. And, you know, I think we've learned a lot, like we're not designing for, we're designing with, and all of these sort of surface level things that most of us sort of, you know, get. But if we're really talking about together, you know, influence, step out, step aside, you know, that all have an impact on how you move forward, how the process itself of design. So I'm not talking about, you know, the kind of tools I meant in the beginning, but how does one do that? And if you have any of those experiences or ideas for us, because I feel like, you know, then you've got kind of, all of us have skin in the game. We're starting, you know, we're thinking about where are we heading. I just feel like with our little methods, that's cool, but we're not really embracing, you know, a depth in this work if we're not really inviting in to, you know, we still have the power in terms of like, okay, this is what we're gonna do, then we're gonna do that, then we're gonna do that, and then we're gonna deliver on this date. And, you know, if we're lucky because of Design Matters, we'll implement, you know. But how do you, what are your thoughts about that?
I got a lot of thoughts on that. I appreciate you making that point. We talk a lot about equity design and co-design and what have you, but is it actually implemented in our work? And it's, I have some potential alternatives that I look to say, if it's going to be done here, here are people, communities, and resources that have done it well. But additionally, I want to add in a bit of my perspective as to why it's so hard to get it to change in the institutions in which we sit, right? A few pieces, and I didn't include them because they are not, actually I should, because I did in other places. One favorite book that I consistently go to in talking about participatory design with respect to democratic power is called Design as Democracy. You might have heard of it. I love it. I love it. I love it to death. If anything, it's a collection of definitely toolkit resources, but examples of those toolkits being used to try and affect democratic change in a litany of different projects. Another resource I haven't had a chance to connect with, but I just had a conversation with the scholar in Oceania. It's called Beyond Sticky Notes. It's about a resource, Kelly Amacherker, I believe is their name, that there's a litany of different resources about participatory design and how to engage in it and facilitate it. And I have many of those resources myself, but she's been practicing it for the past, I'd say 10 to 15 years. And she said, she told me personally, I have become very good at making a case for participatory and co-design with people that don't believe its value. So I made those cases and then turned it into a book, right? And I think that's so essential in our work, especially in the places that we sit, whether we're a student, whether we're a professional, whether we're a teacher, because we are involved in systems that make it so immensely difficult to push towards things that would be more community oriented, that would be more equitable, that would be more facilitated. For instance, someone mentioned previously about the difficulty of working inside the school project system, right? You have 16 weeks, you get it done from beginning to the end. And you're trying to teach at the same time that you're trying to facilitate and generate ideas, at the same time that you're trying to build in an input of the community members or the stakeholder that you're a part of, right? And so much of that practice means stuff happens in the in-between and they come up with something, and then the co-design happens in the middle, right? And that system, that structure that we can speak to makes it immensely difficult to offer up community change, interaction, to shift what the project is going to be a part of, because you need to build it in from the beginning to the end, right? The fact that the grading system, right? People, how they're used to being like, I want 100 on this class, I want to do as well as I need to. It's me against everyone else, right? All of those dynamics that fit and sit. And when those environments come up, I think the valuable thing I come across are direct examples of, especially in those disciplines, of communities that have made it work somehow against all odds to say, this is truly in that example, potentially, academically influenced participatory design for social impact that allows for adaptation, change, and learning of the students and everyone else involved. So many of the examples I just presented, I found and got excited about because they offered alternatives to the world in a system with all of these systemic pressures. And that's the reason why it's so difficult to answer your question now, because I don't have exact examples with the ways that they do exist. But I've seen them exist in other environments and situations, especially because they had to exist outside of our academic systems of structures, right? Trying to support and develop interaction, environment, and graphics designers that potentially go into industry or go into policy environments or go into studios, right? And asking one question requires you to ask the questions of the validity of the entire structure. But there are opportunities to integrate those learnings from other different spaces into ours. They're just immensely difficult. And I appreciate you giving voice to that. But I'm going to try and think of other resources I know that specifically talk about communities that have done it right and try and get back to you on that. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I have a question. Hi, my name is Malebo. Can you hear me?
I can. Dume Lama.
Okay. Likai? Likai?
Liteng?
Okay. Okay. I have a question just relating to the entrepreneurial hack that you did in Botswana. In terms of how did you reconcile the discrepancies, the access discrepancies? For example, many a times those who have access to projects or to design projects, etc., are those who've had access to education and design resources, and we have this mass inequality and a community that does not have access to anything digital or anything at all. So how do you then, when you work in a country like Botswana, reconcile that access factor in terms of the design work that you're trying to do for the community? Because many a times you end up working with the privileged community, the ones who have resources.
It's so hard. First of all, apologies for my improper Setswana. I need to learn more, and I appreciate you on that context. The reason why it was made so hard from the experience that I saw is the fact that the entrepreneurial and innovation systems, specifically in Botswana, were developed particularly for the center, that is for the community in Gaborone, creating businesses, interventions, and design resources for the outside. So as you know, Botswana diamonds, that's how the economy was constructed and has lived for since 66, right? But the difficulty in creating that unilateral economic structure is so many of the systems, how businesses are considered valuable, how they get funded by the Botswana Innovation Hub, how and who can access the types of education, who can get into and gain the resources from UB, University of Botswana, and what they do with those resources. Do they decide to use that to start their own business, and are they going to be picked up by another company? All of that activity and those struggles, it is happening at the centralized location, obviously in Gaborone and around, a little bit around the outskirts, and potentially a little bit in some other small places, be it Maun. And the struggle with that is the fact that, as I don't have to tell you, that there are so many other different ways that other communities outside of the main city could benefit from the intellectual property, from the understandings of, hey, we have a problem, let's use a business model canvas to try and create a business to address it. Hey, you are trying to figure out how to make a little bit more money off of the cows that you have. Like, here's this extra business or this other resource. Hey, you're trying to make a little bit of goat milk, right? And you're trying to build out this new thing for yourself. That access to not just the thinking, but the mindset to move entrepreneurial work forward is considered only valuable if it is a part of the 5 different pieces of BIH, or if you are accessing something from another large company in the country. And that makes it difficult, that in so many ways that's reflecting of many of the other systems that us in the US are experiencing, with who has access to thinking about design, who can create entrepreneur resources, who can connect to people that can fund their business at the beginning to like get it off of the ground, right? All of that stuff, which is why IDDS was so it was rare in so much of the work that was being developed, but it means that so many of those problems that make those connections need to be solved at the same time. It's whether or not you drive out to Dakota, or if you're to connect with the San that are out there, whether or not you need to how you, if this is a consideration, how you're going to make sure you build out funding, or you make sure that you're planting things. All those connections, there's disconnections between people that are outside of the center and people that are at the center. At the same time, though, that means that there's real valuable opportunities for people that really solve those problems. When I went out to, at the beginning of the 1,000-kilometer desert race that happened in 2019, I believe. I can't remember the name of the mining town, but I went out with an entrepreneurial community to do a workshop on business model canvassing, on trying to figure out how the community could build entrepreneurial work. And as much as difficult as it is to do entrepreneurial work in that community, the community was impassioned to figure out what's next. It is essential in that area, the real economy of how things were moving, were the entrepreneurs trying to have braai out on the side and have communities selling out certain pieces of candy, so that entrepreneurial focus is there. The question then becomes, how do you make the connection between these other design resources that could be useful with the communities that are so distanced in so many different ways from the rest of the resources that happen in gaps or anywhere else? It's a very difficult project, but admittedly, I would love to have a further conversation to figure out how to make it contextually useful in your area. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm from South Africa, by the way.
Oh, my apologies. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's okay. My mom is Tswana. It's okay.
Got it. Copy.
Yeah.
Cool. I recognize the name. My apologies.
That makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
Botswana is in South Africa, so.
It is not.
It's a landlocked country within South Africa.
I appreciate you for being here. Any other questions?
All right, if there's no other questions, going once, going twice, we want to thank Dr. Pierce Gordon for, as my grandmother would say, taking us to church today and providing us with some amazing and valuable information that we can tangibly use. Before we exit, couple of announcements for the students in particular in the room. Dr. Gordon is offering more intimate time through office hours. We have some slots still available for this afternoon starting at 4 o'clock, 20-minute increments. If you want to come and talk about any current works you're working on right now, if you want to chat about research or just art and design in general, please email me. I'll put my email in the chat and I will let you know what times are available. We have about 4 slots open, so please take advantage of that time that he is giving us. Secondly, to both students again and faculty, for tomorrow, he will be also offering smaller roundtable discussions in the afternoon starting at 2 p.m. We're hosting about 12 to 15 folks in each group. So again, you're going to be able to have some more intimate one-on-one time with him, bring your questions as well there. So that said, we appreciate you, Dr. Gordon, for being here with us today. I appreciate everyone that took their time this afternoon to be with us. I want to recognize my DesignMatters team. I see Lee, Garrett Scullin, Jennifer May, and Stephen. I don't think they're in the room, but just want to thank my small but mighty team for bringing this all together for you guys today. So with that said, be well, breathe, especially today. You know, we will get to the finish line, definitely. But thank you, Dr. Gordon. And we'll see you in a little while with our students. So, and again, students, please take advantage of that opportunity to meet with Dr. Gordon if you have anything you want to chat with him about.
I want to meet y'all. Come on, y'all. Let's talk. Let's chat. Number one. Number two, Amber, what's up? I love you, Amber. You the homie. What's good? Pleasure to have y'all there. I can't wait to see y'all in the meetings. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone. All right.
Well, thank you.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Whew.
Yeah.
Man. How y'all doing? Y'all all right?
Doing great. Doing great. Got a sheet full of stuff to take back to our team and our students.
Yeah.
Some really good information. Oh,
Appreciate
Jennifer is. Have you met Jennifer yet? I don't know if you've met Jennifer.
I don't think I have.
No, not yet. Here she is. She's coming in. This is Jennifer May. She's our executive director of DesignMatters.
Hello, Executive Director Jennifer May.
Hi, I'm sorry I had to drop off. I had a call at 2 that snuck onto my calendar without me noticing.
I am blessed that you were here in the first place. I could not tell who dropped off nor who came back on as I was presenting. So we're all good. It's a pleasure to meet you.
You as well. I'm from Little Rock, actually.
Ah, nice. I'm across the what's the name? Across the river. Do you know about Argenta?
Argenta, I don't think so. I haven't lived there since I was 18, so
Got you.
it's changed a lot since I was there. I think it's